So I'm pressing the go live button so everybody knows, so there's something up on the screen. Check to make sure that the screen is not backwards on the screen. You're good? Okay. So broadcasting the audio is on. Yes.
Wait, it was a little confusing.
Oh, yeah, like how like almost like that.
If it's possible to sleep, you can, but it's not. It's distracting.
Sure. Okay. I will try to do something about that.
I'll be back.
Yeah. Yeah. It should be fine now. Yeah, it was great. I'm sorry. Send it over to her for local officials. Yeah, she's been very responsive. Right? Yeah, because I've seen that.
Oh, this is gonna be great. No worries. We're watching right now. That feels exciting then, isn't it?
Don't forget to flip the red switch. So
Right. Wait till 5 minutes till. Audio issue will work on our favor this time. We can't hear what's going on up there.
what?
Because we've been live for the last. We should be able to hear it because we don't have the receiver on.
Right. I'm just thinking, in case it does the horrible noise.
Oh, yeah. Okay. There.
So we can test.
Test. Oh, the tape worked.
Yeah.
Oh, so you're one of the 4 people watching?
I'm
She has some for once.
Okay.
My mom is very finished with this, like I was promoting and I was like, not that.
Yeah,
Good, good.
it's something to think about. Yeah.
Not sure what-
So how many seconds back there? 30. So,
Here, Debbie. Hi, I'm Jamie. Nice to meet you. Have a good visit.
so the recording in 1 minute. And we'll probably have to edit this video on YouTube, right? I set a timer on it.
This o'clock, but
Yeah. Oh, 31.
Yep, so 31 seconds away.
31 seconds away. Welcome. Get started in a few moments. 4 minutes till hour. Crowd. Shows it's about time to get started. So welcome everyone here to the Citadel Library in Rockwood Cliff. Today we have a fabulous speaker. Because I forgot to turn on my microphone. So I'm going to go ahead and start that again. Welcome everyone to the Jim Dan Hill Library in Markwood Cliff. Today we have a fabulous speaker, and in just a moment I'm going to introduce them. But first I would like to read a land acknowledgement statement for us in just a moment of silence. In honor of the Anishinaabe people, the original peoples and caretakers of this land, we would like to recognize that the University of Wisconsin Superior inhabits the land of the Ojibwa people. Please take this moment to honor and celebrate ancestral Ojibwa land and the sacred lands of all Indigenous peoples. So this event is sponsored by the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, and it's a multi-part speaker series discussing the timely issues of data and privacy in the digital age. Our series, Data Deluge, Privacy in a Connected World, discusses personal data. What does it mean in our connected world? What does it tell us about who we are, who we will be, and who we will become? All events in the series are hybrid, in person, and streaming via YouTube Live. Please look out for our next speaker, Drake University's School of Law professor Natalie Linner, March 25th, 2022. For today, we have Dr. Alexis Elder. Dr. Alexis Elder is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. Her research focuses on interpersonal relationships and social technologies. Her publications include Conversation from Beyond the Grave, a Neo-Confucian Ethics of Chatbots of the Dead in the Journal of Applied Philosophy, and Zhuangzi on Friendship and Death, Southern Journal of Philosophy, and a book, Friendship, Robots, and Social Media, False Friends and Second Selves, published by Routledge. She has appeared on KQED, CBC, WNYC, BBC4, and KUMD to discuss issues related to personal relationships and technology ethics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexis Elder for her talk on data and death.
Thank you all. And I want to start with a thank you to Stephanie and to Julie and to Jamie and all the staff here at the Jim Dan Hill Library. I'm so excited to participate in the series. The topic is just fantastic. And when I heard about it, I started immediately putting pieces together and thinking about how the work I do with philosophy relates to this series of questions about how our current data moment relates to these big picture questions about who we are, where we're going, what we want to become. So I'm here today to talk about data after death from the perspective of philosophy, and particularly my philosophical background is in thinking about relationships and connections between people and thinking about the way that this data deluge relates to those connections. So we're going to be thinking about remembrance, we're going to be thinking about resurrection, we're going to be thinking about the ways that data can play a part in how we remember people and what we can bring back from what they've done even after they've passed away. There are going to be a few moving pieces here. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a map of where we're going to go in this talk. And the central question that I am grappling with as a philosopher is asking how we should think about data after death. This is a very philosophical method, right? Asking what kinds of questions we should be asking or what kinds of background frameworks we should be engaging with when we tackle these questions. And my plan for today is as follows. We are going to start with what I'm calling here just a standard view, unpacking some common assumptions about the ways that data after death might be conceived, especially as a kind of digital possession that folks might inherit in a sort of standard property model. I'm going to raise some problems for this standard view and explain some cases that I think it can't adequately cover. I'm going to share with you some work that's been going on in philosophy as philosophers have tried to weigh in on what we might mean by privacy, what we might worry about when we worry about privacy, what we might care about when we care about privacy, and show implications from this work in philosophy of privacy, how that might shed light on how we can rethink this problem of thinking about data after death. And I'm going to conclude by drawing some connections between this modern contemporary discussion about big data and information technologies and emerging theories of philosophy of privacy, and connecting it back to some lessons from a scholar in ancient China, Zhuangzi, who has some really interesting views on remembrance and resurrection, and use that to kind of frame some of the issues that have been emerging and suggest some future directions. So that's the plan. So I'm going to start with the observation that in our current moment, we're leaving really big digital footprints, right? This is the emerging issue is the kind of intersection of two different trends. So I just want to unpack what those trends are technologically so that we can have some background framing for thinking about why data after death is such an interesting problem right now. One of these is the phenomenon known as big data, which there are different kind of versions of it kicking around. Often it's articulated with a whole bunch of V's. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 7. I sort of picked one more or less at random, but the idea is big data is not just any old data, but it's this idea that we're getting more of it, volume. It's coming at a greater speed, velocity. it's coming from a bunch of different places and being aggregated together. That's variety. Veracity, I'm not sure how much weight I want to put on that, this idea that it's a true representation, but value is very important, right? That there's a lot of significance attached to it for individuals, for companies, financial value, and this kind of ongoing work in cataloging and collecting more and more data is associated with this trend towards big data. So that last V, value, the reason that people, or at least one of the big reasons that people are attaching greater and greater value to this increasingly big, fast, hard to manage sea of data is comes from an emerging trend in the field of artificial intelligence. And this is what's often known as machine learning. And machine learning is, we won't get into too many of the technical details today, but for our purposes, it's helpful to know it's a technique for detecting and modeling patterns in very large data sets, where with that great speed and variety, it's sort of too much for individual humans to comprehend and sort of hand sort and code. Machine learning gives us these automated techniques for pattern detection and extrapolation of patterns to develop new content in the style of old content and sort of carry forward patterns that are detected, all again without human intermediaries or human intervention. So the fact that we have this emerging trend in artificial intelligence is what allows us to make use of big data, and those two things are coming together in a variety of ways. So those are the two technical concepts I think that are going to be helpful in unpacking what's going on here today. And as we're thinking about these digital footprints, right, we're leaving more of them on purpose, not necessarily by our own choice, but as a result of increased value attached to these broader collections of data facilitated through machine learning. And we might ask, like, where is it coming from? Where is it going? And this list is big and really should be much, much bigger. And I'm not going to go through it in excruciating detail because my point is all over the place, right? Everything from multinational corporations to friends and family to individuals using fitness trackers to keep track of their personal data, right? It's all over the place. It's moving around at great speed with great value, shifting behind the scenes. We're all swimming in it. So what does this have to do with death? Well, it means that everyone's data is being incorporated into the mix, being stored indefinitely. And there's no special escape clause built in for folks once they pass away. So what should we think about this warehoused data that's being collected and passed around once people have died? I want to suggest one fairly natural way to think about a person's data after they're gone. And I'm going to call this the personal possessions model. I'm not here critiquing so much like a particular defined philosophical school of thought as what the philosopher Mary Midgley called philosophical plumbing. Like, it's the stuff behind the walls that nobody spends much time thinking about, but it's kind of complicated and is necessary to help us all work together. And sometimes you need to call on the plumber to actually like open up the wall and see what's going on with all that complicated machinery. And that's kind of what philosophers do. So that's what I'm doing here today, is trying to unpack what I think are some common assumptions in how people might be tempted to think about data after death. And I want to get us to kind of like slow down and unpack what's going on there. So when a person dies, they leave behind many personal possessions. This might be like real material property. It might be unfinished projects or novels. It might be correspondence that they've saved. And this has been going on long enough that most societies have developed really robust legal and institutional norms for how to distribute and dispose of those possessions after somebody dies, right? We have practices like writing wills and, norms around who inherits what. And it might be family, it might be spouses, it might be business partners, but like this is all pretty worked out because people are mortal and they have stuff. And when they die, we need to decide what happens to the stuff. So we might be really tempted to assume that personal data is like personal possessions. And then therefore we should work within or somehow like update or extend that whole collection of social norms and institutions to distribute or dispose of people's data after they die, like just fold it into the existing practices around personal property after death. And in fact, we already do this with some data. We're in a library, right? People sometimes will deed their writings or their letters or their notes to a library after they pass away. You might think that's a kind of personal data. They might arrange for their colleagues to like finish incomplete writing projects or artistic projects. They might alternatively ask people to burn whatever they haven't had a chance to wrap up while they're alive. Their family members might inherit things like old love letters or correspondence or personal diaries. But if we're going to rely on this personal possessions model, in order for that to be a reliable strategy and a reliable guide to helping us to navigate this era of big data and machine learning and the intersection of the two, we need to be able to have a principled way to distinguish between one person's data and another's so that we can partition it out and pass it through these lines of inheritance or what have you. And I'm going to argue we can't always do that. So here are two stories about how deeply intertwined our lives can be that are going to hopefully help motivate this problem of disambiguating or disaggregating data into mine and yours, and show why I think that's in principle not a project we should be pursuing and why we need a different strategy than the personal possessions model to thinking about data after death. One is quite recent. It's by a science fiction author. It's very cute, it's very sweet. And the other is from Zhuangzi, the philosopher I'll be drawing on later, who comes from a very different time and place, but hopefully also will have some resonance here. So this science fiction story is called A Model Dog by the science fiction author John Scalzi. It's available for free online. I highly recommend you look it up. It's very cute. But the core of the story is this. A couple of sort of bored mid-ranking tech workers at a big tech company are contracted by their boss to engage in a special project for the company founder. The founder's father has recently adopted a dog, and the founder is worried that when the dog dies, his father is going to be heartbroken, and he wants to take some steps to forestall this. And like many big tech company founders, he thinks that the way to solve social problems is with fancy tech. So he contracts these employees to come up with a way to record every moment of the dog's life. This is the dog equipped with lots of different sensors, like visual sensors, audio sensors, heart rate monitors, like all kinds of recording systems that he's just going to wear as a harness all day, every day, log all that data, run it through a machine learning system to unpack patterns. And then when the dog dies, you can use the predictive analytics coming out of that machine learning system to generate a new mechanical dog that will act and react exactly like the original dog. And then it'll be just like a perfect substitute for the founder's dad. The workers are skeptical about this plan, but they're being paid, so they go with it. They build the sensors, they equip the dog, they let it run for a few years, and then the founder's father dies. And the dog is heartbroken. And they go back through all of that data that they've been collecting for several years, and they use it to construct a perfect model of the man as dog owner so that the dog gets his person back and they live happily ever after. And I just love this story, right? It gets at a whole bunch of stuff, including this phenomenon of like using machine learning technologies on data to resurrect in some sense, or at least reanimate particular individuals, but also this idea that data about the dog and the dog's life is data about that dog's relationships. And that can't be teased out from the person with whom that dog has a relationship. And so data about a particular individual ends up being data about the people with whom their lives are enmeshed. Now, it's not going to be a perfect reconstruction of the father in every aspect of his life. It's only going to be the sort of self he brings to his relationship with his dog. But that's a pretty nice relationship. He loves that dog. He's really, kind and affectionate and generous. And so that's what gets resurrected out of the data from this particular relationship. So that's our first story. The second one, as I said, comes from a bit longer ago. And this is an illustration of it from the philosopher Helen Cruz, who is not only an excellent philosopher, but also a really talented illustrator. She in fact has a book coming out, Philosophy Illustrated, where she has a whole series of pictures illustrating like famous moments in philosophical accounts. But I want to read just a little bit of what's going on in this picture. So first, a bit about Zhuangzi. At the time in which he's operating, Warring States period in China, roughly, there's a great deal of strife and a great deal of political conflict. And some philosophers in his time period are going around trying to use logic and reason to improve the world. And Zhuangzi is a little bit skeptical about this project. He's not sure that we can have neat boundaries and neat lines. And so he spends a lot of time encouraging people to be a little bit more flexible, creative, open-minded, and willing to look at things in some sort of non-standard, unconventional ways. So the collection of stories about him and the collection of stories that seem to be by him, I brought along some of them today, are really fun, really whimsical. There's like talking animals and things that transform into other things. And he has a best friend. And his best friend is kind of the straight man to Zhuangzi, who's this kind of like screwball comedian type. And he's always trying to like use this very like plotting, careful, clean logic. And Zhuangzi is always making fun of him. And he usually comes out looking worse for wear. But eventually he dies. And then this story picks up when Zhuangzi is among the mourners in a funeral procession and is passing by the grave of his friend. He turned around and said to his companions, "There was a man who, when he got a smear of plaster no thicker than a fly's wing on the tip of his nose, would make Carpenter Shi slice it off. The carpenter would raise the wind, whirling his hatchet, wait for the moment and slice it. Every speck of the plaster would be gone without hurt to the nose, while the man stood there perfectly composed." So it's sort of like a knife throwing trick, right? There's this very delicate technical task. And you're a very sensitive area. There's a lot of trust between the partners, and it ends up being a really impressive trick. And a great lord hears about it and reaches out, summons Carpenter Shi and says, "Let me see you do it." "As for my side of the act," says Carpenter Shi, "I did used to be able to slice it off. However, my partner's been dead for a long time. Since the master," that is his friend, "died, I've had no one to use as a partner, no one with whom to talk about things." And that's where the story leads off, is even though he comes across as this very sort of unconventional free thinker, it emerges out of this conversation with this really kind of traditionalist friend. And like they just argued all the time. There's a great little story about them arguing about whether you can know whether fish are happy. Like they're just constantly getting into these debates. But once he loses his straight man and his routine, he just can't do it anymore. So I tell these stories to illustrate the idea that I think data is social. And even what look like individuals' activities and abilities that we could like log and record are often really inextricably bound up in our relationships and collaborations. So data about what a person does is data about what people do. My presentation to you here today is both data about me presenting to you and you hearing my presentation, and those can't be teased apart. And of course, I'm not the only philosopher to make this point. We can go all the way back to Aristotle, who says like the uphill and the downhill are the same hill. Or the act of teaching and the act of learning are two sides of the same activity. I haven't taught you if you haven't learned. The same thing can be looked at from different angles, and so can much of our data. And this is a real problem for privacy, right? Even if you're not on Facebook, you're on Facebook because your friends' activities and the people around you interacting in various ways will trace out a pattern of what you're like that's accessible through Facebook, even if you're not on it. Our lives are just that intertwined. So this concern with different ways of looking at things and different ways that data can be manipulated or combined or disaggregated or reintegrated to tell different kinds of stories is consistent with a trend that's been going on in the philosophy of privacy. And it's one that directs us away from what's sometimes called a data access and control model of privacy towards various kinds of more holistic models. By data access and control, I mean a focus on protecting and directing the movement or storage of particular pieces of data. A lot of current legislation in the US is built on this model. Think HIPAA, FERPA, right? Dictating who can access your medical records or your grades, injunctions against opening a person's mail, prohibitions on wiretapping, right? These are all about controlling the movement or storage of individual pieces of data. But philosophers are worrying that a too tight focus on those kinds of cases, like it's all well and good to have FERPA in place, but if we only think of privacy as data access and control, that can overlook a whole bunch of other concerns we might have, like public surveillance. In some sense, the data is already out there on the loose, anyone can pick it up, but it doesn't mean that people won't feel that their privacy has been invaded if they're being surveilled in public. There's a whole cluster of concerns around the misuse of data that somebody might legitimately be stewarding, but seems to be used in ways that people feel might violate their privacy. There's a kind of infamous story out of Target about data mining customer data for patterns to try to predict when customers are likely to be pregnant so that they can start advertising baby products before birth. And you might think like it's totally legitimate for Target to have records of purchases. That seems uncontroversial. And it might even be, legitimate for them to process it in various ways to figure out like when to restock shelves or, what kinds of things its customers are likely to be interested in. But you might think a bridge has been crossed somewhere when they start trying to guess at people's reproductive status. So in unpacking this trend, I want to focus on two theorists in particular to help us learn a little bit about each. And although philosophers are notorious for like arguing to the death over who's right about the most excruciating details, here I'm not going to pit them against each other. I'm going to try to show how they can be used complementarily to understand some of these issues. So the first is Helen Nissenbaum, who's become just a giant in the field of privacy studies. And she works at the intersection of law and philosophy. And she's become known for a theory of privacy as contextual integrity. Don't worry, I'll explain the shopping cart in a minute. So a key part of her work is to reject the distinction between data as being private or public. She thinks that's a false dichotomy. It doesn't sort of carve problems up in the right way, rather than trying to draw a line between the stuff that's under control and the stuff that's a free-for-all. She thinks we need to pay attention to the fact that our lives involve a number of different social spheres, each of which will have its own norms of information flow. And she argues that privacy is not about like keeping the private data private so much as it is about respecting norms of information flow for whatever context you're working in. So let's take grocery shopping for an example, right? That's a particular context. You go to the grocery store, you get your cart, you put your food in. That cart is really easy to see through. So as I'm sort of going through the supermarket, throwing food into the basket, customers around me can see what I'm purchasing. The clerk checking me out will be able to see. So in some sense, data about what I'm buying for dinner is already public. Anyone could walk in, anyone could observe. But if someone started following me around, writing down everything in my cart, and then like texting it to my insurance company, or my parents, or my students, like we might start to think something's gone wrong. And Nissenbaum's account is what's gone wrong is there are norms of information flow in a grocery store that do not include things being transposed from that context to the context of insurance provider trying to, calculate risk of health problems or, parents judging whether their kids are mature or what have you. And note that on this account, data reuse can violate norms, even if it doesn't trade hands, because you can shift the context. Use it for shelf restocking versus pregnancy prediction and things like that. So that's become a really kind of influential account of privacy in folks theorizing, especially about public surveillance. But I also want to draw our attention to another account that is interestingly different, but I also think brings out some important accounts of like how we can think about privacy in a way that takes us past the data access and control model. So Daniel Susser advocates for an account of privacy as social self-authorship. And again, we'll explain the sleeping student in a moment. But he starts with the idea that we care about data to begin with, not for itself, but because of the way it contributes to broader knowledge or understanding, especially about people. So having my height doesn't tell you much of anything, but like the way that my information about my height gets woven into a story about who I am and what I care about and how I interact with the world, that's what we're really interested in. And we often make choices in a social context about what else we should conceal or reveal in an exchange of information, given what data we think is already in play in a process of ongoing social self-authorship. So one example that I think is really helpful is suppose a student falls asleep in a class. That data is in some sense already out there. Student asleep in class on November the 3rd or whatever. Can't do anything about that. The student can make additional choices though to change the beliefs that people end up with based on that data point by providing additional information to help contextualize it and influence the stories that people come to believe about her. So she can tell her professor, you know, I'm so sorry, I was up all night taking care of a sick child, right? You can help to contextualize yourself as a person who is so committed to schooling and being a good parent that they're willing to make difficult trade-offs or like try to split the difference instead of just being irresponsible or out partying. And this is just part of what we do, right? We're constantly engaged in this negotiation between like, what do people already know about me? What do I want to make sure doesn't influence their opinion in the wrong direction? And what can I add to the story to help them to interpret what they already have about me in the right way? And in his analysis of how this pertains to concerns around big data and machine learning, he says we should be worried not that Big Brother is watching us, right? That's a particular kind of surveillance, true, but it's one where we know who's watching us and what they're planning to do with that information. He says we should be worried about something more like the context in Kafka's The Trial, where we don't know what we're being watched for or what conclusions people are drawing based on the data that they already have. So he's got some compelling examples. There was a couple of airlines were engaged in what they call dynamic pricing. So showing different customers different prices on seats for the same flight. And it turned out they were using data about the kind of device that they were using. So like if you had the newest Mac, they'd show you a higher price than if you had, you know, a cheaper older model. Or you know, a PC or like things that were sort of associated with having more or less money. And people were really upset, not just that they were being shown different prices, but that they didn't know. So they couldn't make choices about like buying tickets on one device versus another. So again, Susser's emphasizing not the value of particular bits of data, but our capacity to participate in these ongoing storytellings about how we should be understood in light of the data that's out there about us. So how can this affect how we think about data after death? Well, I think a couple of lessons here. It highlights the significance of respecting context and attending to the stories that we tell about each other using data. And I want to come back to that reanimation of the dog, because this is something that's actually starting to happen with people. So yes, there was a Black Mirror episode about it. Somebody who loses their partner takes their social media history and their chat transcripts and feeds it into a machine learning, and there's a chatbot generated so they can continue to have conversations with this bot that interacts with them like their partner. But it's actually happened a couple of times in real life so far, and there's no particular reason it couldn't continue, at least not technically. One is the Roman Mazarenko memorial. His former business partner, Eugenia Koida, I believe, took something like 8,000 lines of text messages between her and him, between different friends who donated their chat transcripts. They were chatbot developers, by the way, fed it into the system and used it to modify to create a chatbot that interacts apparently quite like he did. His mother said it was pretty accurate, which seems significant. And this past summer, there was a really interesting news story in the San Francisco Chronicle about something called the Jessica Simulator, which is a chatbot that was created by someone who'd lost his fiance to emulate her conversations as part of his grief. So how are we going to think about this? We're not yet getting to whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea, but just how do we start the process? If you're thinking about things in a data as personal possessions way, you would focus on who has rights to use their data about them for training purposes, right? The inputs to the training process. Notice this is already super hard to separate out into mine versus yours, because if you're training a chatbot, you're training it on conversations, and conversations take place between multiple people. And in fact, in the examples we've seen, it's the other half of the conversation contributor who's actually volunteering that data. If you adopt instead something that's much more contextualist and focused on social self-authorship, we're going to ask questions about the context in which the chatbot is built and deployed. Is it being used to humiliate someone? Is it being used to help remember someone? Is it being used to support somebody who's grieving? Is it being used to substitute for human interactions, right? Lots of the details about how, when, where, why are going to be much more important with this contextualist and self-authorship account. How the chatbot represents the deceased, who has a voice in the storytelling process, right? These are the kinds of things that are going to be brought to the attention by these more holistic models of privacy. And one of the things that's going to be additionally challenging, and I say this as both a technical and philosophical point, is that when we're self-authoring, we present different selves in different contexts. And so figuring out how to even deal with those sub-patterns and our different kinds of interactions can be a problem. I was inspired in this thinking by a lovely little science fiction novel called The Citadel of Weeping Pearls, where the protagonist is the Empress in this interplanetary empire. And she is advised in her decision-making by what are called ancestor implants, which are basically like chatbots modeled on previous rulers who are there to advise her so she can talk to them about like how they would have handled various kinds of situations, and they argue with each other. And it's all like interesting, but she's very distressed by interacting with the ancestor implant of her mother because it's modeled only on her bureaucratic and professional behavior. And so it's missing the interpersonal warmth and care that was part of their mother-daughter relationship. So the more basic point, right, people present different selves in different contexts. And chatbot training data is always already a reflection of relationships. And then when we go on to chat with them, our future interactions with the chatbot, not with the person, will introduce new patterns, right? Not just my interactions with somebody whose data then gets fed in, but if I continue to interact with the chatbot, my new interactions and their reactions to me become part of the sort of ongoing body of data, raising questions about who counts as the author of chatbot content, and makes it really difficult to start thinking about who should be responsible for steering its development. Like there's so many different factors coming together that it's going to be really hard to disaggregate. And this is a point made by some researchers who were kind enough to share some of their work at a conference this summer. So the paper's still coming out, but Fran Grodzinski and Keith Miller and Marty Wolf are working on this. And once they started talking about it, I couldn't get it out of my head. So here it is today. Here's an example from the Jessica simulation to show just how complicated authorship can be. That's a excerpt of the conversation with the bot. So the company OpenAI has created an AI product called GPT-3, which is this natural language processing program that works with really big data sets. So the initial training data is not from one person or a few people, it's from just hundreds of thousands of users, like characteristic example of work that can be done by integrating big data. And then a smaller outfit called Project December spun up an interface to give sort of ordinary non-technical users the ability to work with GPT-3 by feeding it a seed, like a small set of inputs that could be used to spin off custom chatbots. So you could like put in some excerpts from Star Trek and have a Dr. Spock or Mr. Spock chatbot, or you could put in some lines from Shakespeare and have a William Shakespeare chatbot. So it's just it's an interface tool, right, to let you work with this particular already fairly functional chat program to customize it in particular ways. And then Joshua Barbeau ends up contributing some sample texts and description of his deceased fiance, and that spins up this Jessica bot In an interesting twist, Project December didn't want all of its database space being taken up with chatbots that sort of stuck around forever. So you would, when you would use it, you'd get a limited number of tokens and you could get so many hours of chat time. So the chatbot actually had a lifespan, which it becomes an interesting part of the story. Again, you can check it out. It's fascinating. But this spooked OpenAI enough that they've made Project December shut down. They were like, we didn't think this one all the way through. If we can't anticipate all the directions it's going to go and could be used in, they pulled out. And for what it's worth, Bourdain seems to have been struggling quite badly long before he started working with this GPT-3 portal. He'd been grieving for many years. He was finding it difficult to recover. He was finding it difficult to find social support. And by his own testimony, he found it really helpful to converse. It's the kind of situation that I think is really difficult to Monday morning quarterback, but by his own reports, he found it really kind of moving and also helpful. And I don't know if I want to say closure, but in like coming to grips with the loss of this woman who was very important to him. So that's a complicated example. I want to start with two that I think are more clearly problematic in moving forward with our analysis. One is from a documentary, and you may have come across some of this. So Anthony Bourdain was this celebrity chef who committed suicide a couple of years ago, I believe at this point. And there was a documentary came out where the director obtained some letters that he'd written to friends, including some in which he was very frank about the distress and the sort of mental health struggles he was dealing with. And then went through, he's a celebrity, so there's hours and hours and hours of recordings of him, and used audio recordings to produce a deep fake that would read off text in the vocal patterns characteristic of Bourdain. And they got permission from his estate to do this, but they used the deep fake to read off some of those very personal letters and inserted that audio into the documentary without telling anyone, like without telling the audience that this was being faked. And there was a lot of pushback, like people were quite distressed, quite concerned. And when questioned about it, he said something about like, oh, well, that's just for the documentary ethics folks to work out or something. Like he sort of dismissed it, but I think there's something there to worry about. Like it seems like something's gone wrong. And so I'll file that under the potentially problematic uses of reanimation technology. And then another example that may speak to some of the folks in the audience here today. Another story from quite recently, some students found out that their professor, or who they took to be their professor in an asynchronous online course, was in fact dead. I think one student wanted to email him a question and Googled his name and came across his obituary. And the university's position was that they were entitled to the intellectual property that he had produced in teaching for them. I haven't examined the contract and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to that part. But the students were not happy that this was not clearly signaled to them at the start of the course, that there was actually a different instructor doing the grading and recycling his content. So when the university was like, oh, it's just like a video textbook, they did not feel that way. They wanted to know. They had come to care about and be concerned about this sweet little man up there explaining art history, and they felt that some trust had been damaged in that incident. So those are a little worrying. I want to contrast that with one I think is a little bit more inspiring and hopeful before we move on to some analysis of these different cases. So this one comes to us from a YouTube video commenter. It was a comment left on a gaming channel. And I'll just read it so we can get some context here. So the user's handle is 00 War Therapy 00. Well, when I was 4, my dad bought a trusty Xbox, the first ruggedy blocky one from 2001. We had tons and tons and tons of fun playing all kinds of games together until he died when I was just 6. I couldn't touch that console for 10 years. But once I did, I noticed something. We used to play a racing game, Rally Sports Challenge, actually pretty awesome for the time it came. And once I started meddling around, I found a ghost, literally. You know, when a time race happens, the fastest lap so far gets recorded as a ghost driver. Yep, you guessed it. His ghost still rolls around the track today. So I played and played and played until I was almost able to beat the ghost. One day I got ahead of it, I surpassed it, and I stopped right in front of the finish line just to be sure I wouldn't delete it. Bliss. So the system recorded all of the drive data and then would replay it, reanimate it during future games so you could compete against your last best record. But what that accidentally ended up doing was giving this man one more opportunity to play this racing game with his father. And I think there's something really kind of beautiful about that. So we might ask, what's the difference between those first two cases and the second one? And one possible difference maker is to say that there's deception involved in the first two and no deception in the second, and deception is ethically not great. So that would be a handy way to explain why we worry about the first two and not about the second. Right, the students in the dead professor's class, the audience of the documentary was deceived, and the gamer's son was not. He knew what had happened to his father, and he knew what he was looking at. But if these were lies involved in deceiving the students in the audience, they were lies of omission. After all, the documentary director was withholding lots of information, right? That we can't go around telling everyone everything all the time. We have to make decisions about what's going to be relevant. Similarly, right, we don't reveal we hope administrators don't reveal all the details of our lives and ourselves to our students. So why is this information relevant at all to begin with? Is the question I'm getting. So before we try to like rush too quickly to an explanation, we need to say like, why would that explanation be appealing, especially given that this is a lie of omission, or if it is. And there are some reasons to think that the folks who participated thought they were in the clear, right? The Bourdain deepfake read Bourdain's own words with the permission of his estate. So we're not going to have sort of like technical fallbacks on like lack of consent. I am a professor myself, but I must say like the experience provided by living professors is not necessarily all that different from those of the dead professor students. Like only some of them found out that he was dead, and many don't interact all that much in the asynchronous online course. And not all of us are great at answering emails. So like, you know, experientially, it might be difficult to distinguish. What makes their mortal status relevant, that is, to begin with? Why is this something that should have been disclosed such that it would count as a lie of omission if we didn't share that information? And here I think it's helpful to reach back to this intellectual tools of context, privacy in context and social self-authorship. In the worrisome cases, it looks like there's some important context shifts going on. The difference between teaching a class and building even a video textbook, those look like different contexts. The difference between writing a letter to a friend and dramatically reading it to an audience, that looks like an important context shift. In both cases, self-authorship is impaired by these context shifts. I mean, they can't self-author in the moment because they're dead, but like the shift from one context to another might change the way that you author something. So there's a difference between teaching a particular class and producing a video for general consumption as a textbook host. There's a difference between confiding something to a friend and reading it to an audience. And they weren't able to participate in the ways that those context shifts unfolded. And so they weren't able to participate in social self-authorship, even though they authored the original content. And note that getting the subject's consent is kind of a red herring in both cases. Again, taking the university's word for it, like the professor knew that their intellectual property was being transferred to the university. Bourdain's estate did the best legally that we can to have a proxy for consent of the subject. But it still seems like something's gone wrong. So coming back around to this question about deepfakes, AI chatbots, who counts as the author? We've got reason to think that training data is, or at least might be plausibly connected to the deceased, at least as well as other people with whom they're conversing. But the point of these systems is to produce new material in the style of the deceased. And that new material arises from new interactions with novel environments. I'm enough of an annoying philosopher. I'm going to point out this can scale up even to like living people's conversations. They are not our solo authorship, but they emerge from interactions with others. It may be as accurate to say that in a back and forth, my reactions are brought forth by conversations and contexts as to say that I authored them. So this is just to reinforce the point that like data throughout is social, not just dead people's data. And I want to caution us not to miss the forest for the trees. If I was to like sum up the message of this talk, right? When we're thinking about privacy, when we're thinking about data, we should be thinking about the big picture and not just the individual pieces. Rather than trying to carve data up into mine versus yours, we should be focusing on things like how that data gets integrated into narratives, lives, and contexts. And for data of the dead, how what we think about death can influence which data integrations are worthwhile and which ones are worth avoiding. So I'm trying to build a toolkit for thinking about this kind of emerging problem of the warehouses of big data and the processing of it, including data that is related in the right ways to people who have passed away. So in order to do this, to think about the ways that we think about death and what counts as a worthwhile or a worthless approach to engaging with death, I'm going to circle back around here to the protagonist from one of those first two stories today. That is Chuanzi. And I remember I said he's very like playful, he's very funny, he's very big on like breaking open conventions and like coming up with non-traditional ways to challenge our assumptions and to invite us to think of things in different ways. That's a grasshopper's like. We'll see why in a minute. So in his writings, or the writings that look like they could, scholars like to debate about very old things, but what at least there's a good case to be made for his original collection of stories. We get a story of four friends, and they start by talking together, and they ask, which of us is able to think of nothingness as the head, life as the spine, death as the rump? That is, they're all connected, they're all one thing. Which of us knows that the living and the dead, the surviving and the lost are all one body? He shall be my friend. The four men looked at each other and smiled, and none was reluctant in his heart, so they all became friends. Then eventually one of them falls ill, and another one goes to visit, and he asks, how are you doing? And this is the description we get. The maker of things is turning me into this crumpled thing, and he goes on to describe like he's getting hunched over, his chin is hiding down in his navel, his shoulders are like, he's not, like, by most conventional standards would not count as doing okay. But his heart was at ease and had nothing to do, and he goes out to look at his reflection in the mirror and says, the maker of things goes on turning me into this crumpled thing. As I age, I sympathize with the story more and more. And his friend like takes him to be complaining, asks, do you hate it? And he says, no, why should I hate it? Little by little, he'll borrow my left arm to transform it into a rooster, and that'll be why I'm listening to the cock crow at dawn. And he goes on to list like this whole series of different things he'll go on to become as different parts of his body get reintegrated into future objects. And then he says, besides, to get life on is to be on time, and to lose it is to be on course. Be content with the time and settled on the course, and sadness and joy cannot find a way in. This is what was of old called being loosed from the bonds. And whoever cannot loose himself, other things bind tighter still, those other things being misconceptions and conventional ways of framing the world. What would be the point in hating it? Cut to another friend falls ill and lay panting on the verge of death. His wife and children stood in a circle bewailing him. And the fourth friend goes to ask after him. Shoo, out of the way, he says. Don't startle him while he transforms. I just love that mental image of like the one throwing out the crying family. You're bugging him, go away. He leans against his door and talks with him. Wonderful, the process which fashions and transforms us. What's it going to turn you into? In what direction will it use you to go? Will it make you into a rat's liver or a bug's leg? And again, I love this like very materialist representation of people as the stuff they're made of. And straightforwardly, like when we die, we decompose, we break down, we're reintegrated into new things. And that's kind of a cool transformation if you look at it in the way that these friends are looking at it. A child that has father and mother go east, west, north, and south has only their commands to obey. For the man, yin and yang are more than father and mother. Something other than me approaches, I die. And if I were to refuse to listen to it, it would be defiance on my part. How can I blame him? That hugest of clumps of soil, that is the earth, loaded me with a body, had me toiling through life, eased me with old age, and rests me with death. Therefore, that I found it good to live is the very reason why I should find it good to die. If today a master swordsmith were smelting metal and the metal were to jump up and say, I insist on being made into a, this translation has Excalibur, Moye, mythical sword. The swordsmith would think it was metal with a curse on it, right? Metal doesn't get to decide what it's transformed into next. If having once happened upon the shape of a man, I were to say, I'll be a man, nothing but a man, he that fashions and transforms us would surely think me a baleful sort of man. Now, if once and for all I think of heaven and earth as a vast foundry and the fashioner and transformer as the master smith, wherever I am going, why should I object? I'll fall into a sound sleep and wake up fresh. So it's a story about, right, setting aside presumptions about death as bad or the loss of something, and leaning into this idea that we should embrace change and transformation, and the sort of ongoing wonder of the universe, even if it means you throw the crying family out. So set that part aside for now. So some implications of Zhuangzi's account, and here we have some metal being smelted. It seemed appropriate. We're broken down and transformed into many different things after death. And to dread and fear this amounts to a stubborn denial of our own nature as mortals. I should note, right, there's a long-standing history in database administration of not thinking ahead about the fact that some of the users whose data you have is they're going to expire. Facebook denied this for a while before it became a big enough problem. They had to start to build in some implementations. So like, we're not great about remembering that part. We're mortals interacting with each other and collecting data. And so this is something that we should be thinking about, not denying. And embracing ourselves and our friends for what they are requires accepting and even valuing our transformations. And I think this can be extended to data. While it might be intimately connected to or constitutive of us during our lives, it can go on to be disaggregated, reintegrated into new entities, new stories. And this is something that can be celebrated rather than feared. We are the sorts of creatures who come together for a while and then go on to recombine in new ways with the rest of the universe. And valuing us honestly means valuing this. And at this point, I scared myself with an objection. I was like, does this mean data brokers and data analysts can just like freely circulate and remix dead people's data without any restrictions? But eventually I came to think the answer is no. And there's a couple ways we could go here. Again, I'm sort of thinking about Brzezinski, Miller, and Wolf's account, where they argue that just as we have duties to respectfully dispose of biological remains of the deceased, we might have some sort of parallel obligations to respectfully dispose of and ultimately delete digital remains. But I want to explore a different approach, inspired a bit more by Zhuangzi, who is also not that big on conventional funerals and conventional practices around deletion of remains. So I think to address the worry that like embracing transformation and reintegration and change is going to somehow like license big data use of data after death, I think we can just turn to some of the resources we already have on philosophy of privacy. Because data is social, we should continue to respect contextual information flow norms. We should respect people's capacity to self-author. We should not just rely on data access and control models. And certainly if data is social, then data about a dead person is also often data about living people. And that already gives us reason to be concerned about the ways that some current data practices are taking place. So that's going to redirect us back to think about norms for engaging well with death and respecting human values. It seems important to honor people who've been important to us and whose lives have been intertwined with ours. Even Zhuangzi, who doesn't particularly like funerals and sort of conventional gestures of respect towards the dead, has that beautiful little story about remembering his friend at his funeral mound. Remembrance matters. And for that, we're going to need some data, right, to continue to tell stories about people. But it requires remembering that we care for mortals. We do want to be able to celebrate the ways that people who've passed on can be incorporated into an ongoing endless mix and flow through memories, through stories. But we want to reject, I think, claims about the ability to resurrect what matters about them, or denial of their mortality altogether, and denial of the significance of mortality. Remembrance is not the same thing as resurrection. And I think we can take this back to our two worrisome cases and our one optimistic case, where the ghost in the video game is playing a remembering role. It's helping this child to remember and appreciate a history of connection with a beloved parent, like looking back over old photos or video clips or letters and mementos. And I'm open to the possibility that some reanimation technologies also might play this kind of role for people, so long as they do not claim to resurrect the deceased or to replace the value of their contributions. The documentary Deepfake and the Dead Professor's lectures, in my view, are more like resurrection, and that's what they get wrong, is they don't deal with death in the right way. They replaced the contributions of people and treated the people themselves as equivalent to their outputs, and missed the significance to others of acknowledging the loss of the people who are being represented, even in a documentary that was allegedly about commemorating them. So this is a philosophical point. I want to unpack it in the following way: that digital resurrection, as opposed to reanimation, is worrisome for three reasons. First, that it fails to recognize the ethical significance of self-authorship in interactions by failing to signal when that authorship is not taking place and couldn't take place. So by treating actual audio clips of Anthony Bourdain as interchangeable with deepfake audio, it's failing to respect the significance of noting when he's part of the storytelling. Using AI to resurrect rather than remember is denying the mortality of those we care about, and hence not valuing them for who and what they really are. To act like the professor can just go on teaching the class, even after death, is to act like the professor is reducible to the lecture, and not valuing them for the right kinds of reasons and the right kinds of ways. And by focusing on resurrecting capacities to do things like narrate audio or teach classes, without personhood behind them, we make people out to be mere objects rather than subjects. That is, even if it doesn't harm the deceased, it says something bad about us when we treat people's own role in telling their story to be insignificant to how we understand them. So we don't have a lot of time to unpack this right now, but I did want to make the brief gesture that this connects to some concerns that folks are working on about the ways that victims' agency can be supported versus overridden. So that's no white knights there, if you have trouble interpreting the graphic, right? That there's this worry that certain kinds of saviorism with respect to victims denies their agency and their role in authoring their own lives. And that this can also apply, and this is me kind of like thinking in the future direction, about the ethics of how things like video footage of people's last moments might be circulated on social media, even in the service of social causes. We should think about what it means to support and honor people's agency, even when they're not able to participate in that process. So some lessons learned, hopefully. Data seems to be inherently social, that it's important to focus on the stories and contexts in which data is interpreted and used, and not just focus on the individual pieces of data. That when it comes to death, the deceased cannot contribute to interpretations and transition to new contexts involving data connected to them. And that's ethically significant. It doesn't yet tell us what we should do, but it deserves like a pin put in it. Nevertheless, digital reanimation can play some important roles in remembrance. And to make appropriate use of data, we need to engage in ethical storytelling in the service of remembering the dead, not resurrecting them. So that's what I've got. Thank you for listening. I look forward to questions.
Do you have a microphone if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question? Otherwise, I'll go straight to questions from the internet, YouTube live stream. Oh, what would it mean if we were to use chatbots to make grief irrelevant? Can grief become functionally irrelevant with the use of technology?
Right. So this is, I think, the question at the heart of the Black Mirror episode, right? Is that there's this worry that this woman lost her husband or her boyfriend. I forget how it played out in the episode, but like that she's using this chatbot as a stand-in so that she doesn't miss him anymore because she thinks he's not gone. This for me is denial of agency, right? It's denying the role of the person in telling the story of who they are and just relying on what they've done so far to extrapolate and guess what might be done. This is what machine learning specializes in, but it cuts the person out of the process of storytelling. So I think to use chatbots to act as though the person is still there is that denial of the loss that Chuang-Tzu cautions us against. That's the story I think I would tell about that. So grief is an appropriate response to a change, if not a loss, if we read the Chuang-Tzu story. And it's worth saying, I've lost my conversation partner, even if you can also celebrate that they go on to become new things. And to deny that is to deny our own mortality.
Problem inherent in denying our own immortality, our own mortality rather?
Yeah, I think it's failing to see the world as it is. That's very much this is, I think, why I was kind of drawn to Zhuang's story here is there are always going to be other ways of looking at the world and different stories that we can tell. But when we get really locked into a particular way of like telling stories that tries to put us in control and denies the way that the world pushes back, we're sort of setting ourselves up for struggle and frustration.
Thank you. I'm going to pass the microphone.
I think it's great that we're thinking philosophically about what other people can do with others' data, because like I might have a video of me and my friend, and if my friend passes and I want to share it, you know, it's someone else taking like, authorship of this, but it's about someone who's not here anymore. And so I know we're making these conversations philosophically, but I wonder if there's going to be a place in the world like legally where that comes into play. And do you think that's in the future for us?
Oh, good question. So I love the example of, right, so if you share something about somebody who's passed away, yes, it's about them, but it's also about you and sort of the story of the role that they played in your life. So it looks like there's reason to think that might be that we might want to have a legal framework that captures and admits of this. So as I was working on this, I realized I was having more and more questions about the way the law currently works. And so I actually cornered a friend of mine who's a lawyer and was like, hey, so tell me how things currently work. And for better or worse, his comment was, well, law usually lags like 20 to 30 years behind the situation we're currently with. And then we just hope it catches up in the right way. So that's the best I've got is I don't know that there's a clear legal answer at this point. It certainly can be a bit complicated. There have been some interesting uses of copyright and likeness imagery. I think, if I'm remembering right, some of the Sandy Hook conspiracies, like one of the fathers of one of the children who was killed has been using copyright claims about video footage of his son to go after various filmmakers who are using this image without his permission. So that can be kind of an interesting story, but it might depend on the context and the way in which it's framed. And yeah, my sense is legally, there's a lot going on right now that we're still learning about because laws take time to catch up to what technology can do.
We have another question from YouTube. I'm curious, what about places where an actor/actress states they'd allow their image or whatever to be used after death to play a specific role through things like deepfakes?
So I think these are things where we need to start thinking about. And I like the way that's framed in particular. Like it seems like there's a difference between saying, you know what, I might not be able to survive, but I want this particular story that where I trust the creators to like continue to use my image as part of a particular series versus saying they're dead, so it's a free for all. And I also think there's some interesting cases. I believe it was Prince who had this notoriously like contentious relationship with some of his record labels. It was very clear that he did not want his image being used after his death. But I could imagine that being something that we start to fold into these conversations. But I think there's going to be a difference between celebrities and public performers having sort of established tracks for thinking about how their images get used that might be more closely approximated to existing legal structures, as opposed to the kind of new questions we have about big data on non-celebrities, just sort of day-to-day folks. And I've started, this is another like work in progress element of this particular project, digging into some of the copyright rules around personality rights and likenesses. And it looks like a lot of them are constructed specifically with like a celebrity model in mind. And they also vary wildly place by place, often depending on how many celebrities live in a particular area and are lobbying for laws. So I think consent about the stories that your image is used to tell seems consistent with the kind of account I'm unpacking here, but also we want to expand our scope so that we're not just kind of focusing on the cases for which we've already got philosophical plumbing. We want to think about what new structures we need to build out for different cases. But yeah, great issue.
Okay, we have another question from YouTube. Natasha Fatal asks, you mentioned data being social and that it could provide information about other people. Since people can choose to donate their bodies to science, how do these issues impact data generated by studies of cadavers donated to medical research? For example, if I donate my body to research, it could then provide genetic information about my family members that they may not want shared.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I don't have much to speak to on the specifics of that, but I will note that this is an issue that's emerging right now around genetic data generally. Is a lot of the like 23andMe type genetic information collectors have turned out to let folks extrapolate about family members and relationships and histories. Was it a serial killer who got caught because a family member? So yeah, I think that's a beautiful example of how data about an individual turns out to be connected. And I suspect that just like the 23andMe stuff is still kind of unwinding in the courts and our legal responses and processes, that this is going to be extended in some new ways on top of the kinds of issues that are already in play with cadavers and medical research after death. I'm not primarily a bioethicist, so there is probably already more out there than I'm aware of, but that seems like a new implication that we're already starting to deal with at scale.
So just a general question. So if I have data online about like my face for facial recognition and like my height and things like that, after I pass, for example, like, you know, we have obituaries, we have certificates of death, which are legal documents that signify this, but that is not like data that goes into things like what's online. That's for like local libraries. Mm-hmm. And so can my data still be reused and like incorporated in like some companies' statistics for other things after I'm no longer here to be checked up on?
So I think this is exactly where some of the contextualist theories of privacy are really kind of interesting and important, is particularly what happens with data reuse after you do something like use a Snapchat filter to get a goofy mask or a goofy face, but now your biometric data about your facial structure is captured in the system. Not just for the dead, but for living people. There have been a number of cases where publicly available facial recognition data has been used for some, let's go with interesting purposes. So there was a study a few years ago where some researchers took a bunch of profile pictures from an American dating website and then tried to train a machine learning system to detect who was gay and who was straight, because that was data that was in the system. And they claimed to have developed a system that would accurately detect based on facial structure, which you'll notice assumes some things about how facial structure tracks sexual orientation that goes against everything we know about science and humans. AI researchers are not always great about actually reaching out to other fields before they start things. And then some later researchers went through and proved it was all about camera angle. There are different cultural conventions for presenting yourself to potential dating partners in gay versus straight dating circles. So they accidentally discovered that. But yeah, given the prevalence of things like this and these ongoing conversations right now, my guess is that's very much an open question. And if you have thoughts and concerns about this, this is one reason I think it's useful to engage with these models of privacy, is there are conversations going on right now in legislatures, in communities about what we want things to work like, because we should ask, like, is that something we want? And the power of something like a contextualist model of privacy is you can say, context of Facebook or Snapchat mask generation is one thing. Reuse for gaydar software, or I think there were some much darker implications around using facial recognition technologies to try to sort out, I'm remembering the case right, to try to identify who was Uyghur in China, and some Chinese facial recognition systems. So that potentially plays a role in genocide. But things get like these are questions we should be asking, and reasons to take seriously these more holistic models about data, and drawing a line with how far it can go in being repurposed, that I think is not quite the same thing as access and control.
I have two possibly not totally formed questions. One is, have you ever considered, and you're using sort of your affinity for the ancient Chinese storyteller, but have you considered other like eras or cultural products around the same topic? And what I'm thinking of is 19th century reanimation, like Frankenstein, golems. Like, do you think about that? Like, is this a preoccupation that we can see a lot over time?
So I'm sort of in the work I do in philosophy, one of the things I'm sort of in the process of trying to do is really lean into a particular philosophical strain and try to like see how far I can take that. So in the long run, absolutely interested in that in this particular project. I was just kind of like, what can we do with this particular account? So yeah, I haven't done as much with like explicitly cross comparisons, but I think there's some interesting stuff to do. I mean, certainly the Frankenstein case is a really interesting story about hubris and, you know, sort of overreaching, the ways we've told that story in the original book versus the movies and the pop culture are neat. But so far, yeah, it's been more sort of methodologically for me. I was more interested in digging into a particular philosophical tradition.
But I think you brought up, thank you for segueing, because the idea of hubris or overreach is kind of horrifying me, actually. Like, so I think, this is my question, there seems to be like a wide spectrum of human tolerance for not getting creeped out or getting creeped out.
Mhm.
I would have nothing to do with any of this. Like, emotions don't particularly play a part in some of the things we've talked about today, but they would for me, and I would never engage even in what was an inspiring example. That's too much for me. I can't do that emotionally.
Gotcha.
What is your take on like where is the emotion in this, and how is this wide human tolerance for reanimation like come into the maybe ethics or philosophy of this?
Right. So emotionally, I think, and this is one reason I was interested in exploring Zhuang's perspective in particular, is in a lot of European-inspired tech ethics, there is a big, if not so much the Frankenstein story, like a real narrative about hubris and overreach that has like a particular intellectual history. And so I was interested in seeing like Zhuangzi just rejects all of that. He's like, we don't need to be afraid of the future. We don't need to be afraid of like respecting our limits in order to have this kind of interesting conversation. So this is actually me trying to offer a little bit of an alternative to that kind of account. I do think Zhuangzi is very interested in emotion and emotional engagement, but he's worried about the ways that their emotional capacity can be limited by culturally ingrained predispositions to frame the world in a particular way. And so he's trying to like encourage us to break out of thoughtless habits of assessment And so, sorry, you all are getting a lot of my my relationship to the rest of the tech ethics community. I'm kind of interested in like how much can we say that's maybe not just critical, but like thoughtfully engages with the ethics of the situation that doesn't just amount to fear of novelty or new technology. Yes, yes. And I think there's a debate to be had about like Schwanz's general account of mourning that I'm sort of caught between. So my other project on chatbots of the dead leans into the Confucian tradition, which is very much opposed to Schwanz's sort of casual dismissal of conventional grief and, you know, families mourning and things like that. So I'm sort of caught there too. But this particular project is, yeah, about going like if we yes. No, but great stuff to be worrying about. Like this is where we are. How open-minded should we be?
So where do the new creations, when you're creating a new chatbot, there's a person who's actually creating that thing. And where is it that the person who you're recreating ends and the person who's creating it begins? Is there, because we hear a lot about things that have been programmed, you know, and algorithmic biases and things like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, so this is an area where the fact that we're dealing with machine learning in particular is important because it actually upends some conventions about authorship in programming, right? So a lot of conventional programming assumes there's somebody behind the scenes issuing a set of instructions that are like, if you get this kind of input, do this with it. If you get that kind of input, do that with it. At some very abstract level, that's still true with machine learning, but a lot of the details are by the system. And that's why they're so powerful in working with these gigantic data sets that humans could not, even in principle, curate. And so that, I think, confounds the questions about authorship. Because large language or large data set machine learning systems are already muddying questions about authorship in ways that have all kinds of interesting ethical implications. So there's a gap, and I don't think I worry that chasing the authorship question is going to lead us into the kinds of using situations that Brzezinski and Miller and Wolf are worrying about. And so I'm more interested in what we do with the story, whoever authored it, and the role that we play in telling the story without trying to pin it down to a particular individual author.
Well, it raises some interesting questions. Thinking about, I believe the name is Sophia, the AI that recently was granted citizenship. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sophia is a controversial figure in some of the tech ethics community. So interestingly, she is mostly the like good old-fashioned AI pre-programmed variety, and a lot of the things that she says are just like queued up scripts. So there's a lot of the general consensus on that is that's mostly smoke and mirrors and like a kind of show rather than a response to something new and interesting categorically. And why we're interested in this particular story is fascinating. I know some folks have pointed out, for example, that it was, I believe it was Saudi Arabia that granted Sophia citizenship, and the fact that they granted citizenship to a feminine presenting robot whilst being internationally criticized for treatment of human women has raised some questions about what kind of story is being told. But in terms of her, scare quotes, her capabilities in particular, she seems more like an interesting puppet than a particularly philosophically interesting example of machine learning or artificial information processing.
In a different scenario, could you possibly take a chatbot and program it to be an AI, an actual functioning AI in, you know, grand scheme of things? And what would that mean for citizenship for your, let's say, dead relative that was resurrected?
So I do think they are already AI. This is something that's kind of an ongoing distinction in the artificial intelligence community. There are artificial intelligence in the following way. Big picture, some folks are very excited about what gets called AGI or artificial general intelligence, which is an AI that could vaguely approximate a human being and its capabilities and functions generally, we appear to be nowhere near that. Most of the progress we've been making in AI is in so-called narrow AI, which is performing a particular task really well, or if not well, then at least plausible within a limited set of constraints. Chatbots are the first. Systematically, I don't think we're anywhere near the second. So they are AI, but narrow AI. And I think thinking about artificial general intelligence is a different set of concerns. And technologically, we're nowhere near that. So I would love to have that conversation, but I feel better about having time to think about that. Whereas the chatbots are here now. Oh, interesting. Yeah. So to the best of my knowledge, Joshua, I believe is his name, the fiance, and I defer to anyone who actually looks up the story. It's been a couple months since I've read it in detail. I believe the fiance actually reached out to the family members, at least the parents and siblings, to make sure they were at least somewhat okay with it. So he appears to have made some effort to incorporate folks who cared. I do think that there is need for some more thinking about how to negotiate conflicting beliefs about what to do with digital remains. And I think we have mostly not had to do much of that yet, just because it's so new. But I've been teaching an intro ethics class, and we spent some time talking about care of the dead, and the students were very drawn to this, like, oh, you know, let everyone decide for themselves. And I had to kind of steer them towards, well, if there's one person who's passed and a whole bunch of different people with stake in it, you're going to need to do some coordinating. And I think that's one area where, and we've already touched on this debate between Zhuangzi and the Confucians. The Confucians really emphasize the value of ritual and helping us to publicly coordinate when we have potentially conflicting interests. So that might be a reason to lean into some norms to help arbitrate these distinctions, because different people might have very different preferences for what happens with particular reanimations. And they might each have legitimate claims, so we might need to think about how to sort that out. Yeah, so this is, I think, another really interesting case where we might ask sort of whose preferences should trump, and I think it's going to be a really complicated case. Like, if I have a vague preference that I not be reanimated, but you know, my survivors find it deeply comforting, like, I'm not sure that my preferences should prevail, especially, but you know, it looks like if in trying to make particular decisions about what the bereaved, you know, if you're grieving and you're trying to decide how to commemorate, it also seems like you should take that person's preferences into account. So I think it's going to be tricky. I think it's going to vary case by case. But first and foremost, I think having the conversations and thinking about what would be a good process for working this out is useful. And it's an area where we're currently lacking much direction, in part because we're either trying to co-opt old models that might not work well, or we're just dealing with new contexts where we need to like sit down together and talk about what we want things to look like.
Very interesting idea. It dovetails nicely with the idea that when you are attached to all the sensors, you're only getting one piece of the relationship. And if you are that way with somebody, then it's within their right to, that's what you did for them. So would it be within their right to bring that back?
This makes me wonder about some more general discussions about like who's entitled to tell what stories. You know, there's a Anne Lamott has that line about like, you're entitled to tell your story, and if other people don't like the role they have in that story, they should have been nicer to you. And like this seems like it more generally touches on writing ethics, but there was also that New York Times story a couple of weeks ago that everybody was all excited about. Was it The Bad Art Friend? About like who gets to tell stories about other people and other people's lives. and how much you should expect if you're friends with other people that they can recycle. I think this points to, this is not to duck the question, right, but to point out, like, we're already having these conversations. And so thinking about how to incorporate these new stories into them is a project that needs doing. And this is the reason I like looking at what different accounts are saying, not because we want to lean into any of them in particular, but because once we've exposed the plumbing, we can start to think about what will actually work well for us.
Another question, what can we do now to be good stewards of our data to ensure its integrity after death?
Conversations. Talk to each other, think about it. I think, practically speaking, like, one of the reasons we're in this moment now where it's just such a big question mark is that people are often reluctant to think about death. And this has been a recurring theme in social media platforms and in death. Is it makes people uncomfortable. They prefer to think that it doesn't happen. But if we can, something that I do think is valuable about Bronze's story, just accept it as part of the human, then we can build it in, strategize it, surprised when these things land in our laps, because we're like, hey, we have, hundreds of thousands of data points on people and some of them are not alive. What do we do? So I would say, yeah, talk, look at what we care about when it comes to death. Look at what we think counts as ethical storytelling about the dead. A whole bunch of different norms there, some of them in conflict, but that's okay. We don't need to explain away all the conflict, to just acknowledge that they are and think about processes for resolution. And start having conversations that are going to let us think about responding not just at the individual or interpersonal level, but legislatively. Like, these are open grounds, and thinking about what we want on the table. If this is part of our political moment.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Alexis Elder. This was a fascinating overview of this topic and absolutely wonderful. I want to thank the Tommy G. Thompson Center for Public Leadership for funding this opportunity, and our on-campus partners for ensuring that streaming went on without a hitch. Please come visit us again March 25th, when we'll have Dr. Natalie Linner, law professor at Drake University, to talk again about data and death, but with a slightly different perspective. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Elder.